The Rice Alumni Traveling Owls program offers exciting intellectual itineraries to destinations across the globe. Traveling Owls trips serve as a catalyst for lifelong learning and strengthen bonds between Rice University alumni and friends. But you don't have to be a Rice alum to participate in Traveling Owls programs. I'll be hosting a Traveling Owls trip to Southeast Alaska in August 2026 on a tour organized by National Geographic Lindblad Expeditions. We would love to have you join us. Visit alumni.rice.edu/travelingowls for all the details. You can also call 713-34-TRIPS or email travelingowls@rice.edu to ask questions or sign up. Whales are some of the largest, smartest, and yet least understood animals on the planet. The largest animal that has ever existed, larger than any dinosaur, is the blue whale, which can reach lengths of over 100 feet. Many whales also have complex behaviors, including social interactions that rival those of primates in their intricacy and sophistication. Yet because whales live in the ocean and spend much of their lives far below the water's surface, it can be hard for marine biologists to study them. That means there's still a lot we don't know about whales.
Oh my gosh, no one's ever asked me about whale lice before, so this is so exciting.
Yes, all right, good.
It's like a tiny, tiny crab, but you'll see them on the outer side of a whale. Like, they don't live inside, and they don't live in their hair because, of course, whales don't have hair.
Woo! This is Wild World. I'm Scott Solomon. In this episode, we're heading to a place that's paradise for whales and whale biologists. Alaska is a place of superlatives. It's by far the largest state in the U.S. It's home to the highest mountain in North America and more than 27,000 glaciers. In the winter, it gets dark and cold. The record low was minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit. But because Alaska is so big, there's a big difference between regions. While the far north extends well into the Arctic Circle and is home to polar bears and caribou, at its southern end, Alaska has a much milder climate. Southeast Alaska, which extends along the western edge of the Canadian province of British Columbia, has dramatic coastlines carved by glaciers, where mountains covered in dense forest plunge down toward the sea. This is a land where brown bears hunt for salmon, making their way upriver to spawn, as bald eagles soar overhead. There are also over 1,000 islands, ranging in size from just a few rocks to as much as 90 miles long. The Pacific Ocean winds its way from north to south, forming a marine maze known as the Inside Passage. The waters off the coast of Southeast Alaska are some of the best places in the world to see whales. Whale watching has become a big business, drawing hundreds of thousands of tourists each year. But it's also a pretty ideal place to be a biologist that studies whales. And that's exactly what brought my guest here. Dr. Heidi Pearson is professor of marine biology at the University of Alaska Southeast in Juneau. She has a bachelor's degree in biological anthropology and anatomy and biology from Duke University, and a PhD in wildlife and fisheries sciences from Texas A&M University. Heidi Pearson, welcome to Wild World.
Thanks for having me.
So you right now are in Juneau, Alaska, right? And you're in a studio, but could you maybe give us a little bit of a sense, like if you looked out a window or stepped outside, what does it look like today in Juneau?
Today in Juneau is what I call a Juneau day. It is overcast, there's some light rain, and even though it's mid-May, I think we're probably going to top off at about 50 degrees Fahrenheit today. We have some low clouds. The clouds can be quite beautiful, though. If you look on the mountains, they can hang in the mountains and the trees in really interesting ways. So when you live here, you have to get used to a lack of sunlight, but you learn to find beauty in things like these interesting clouds that hang in the rainforest trees.
So I've been to Juneau once many years ago. I'll actually be back in Alaska in 2026, which I'm very excited about. But I remember Juneau as being this kind of small town, but really kind of vibrant and really, really beautiful. Like, I mean, it's on the water, right? It's in Southeast Alaska. There's mountains around. I think there's a glacier nearby. Is that right?
Yes, that's all correct. So I like to think of our city. We have about 33,000 people that live in Juneau as a little hidden jewel in the Alaskan wilderness. We are the state capital, which brings a lot of benefits. And as you say, it's kind of a thriving community. Even though we're quite small, we have a strong art scene. We have a lot of federal agencies here. Of course, at the capital, there's a lot going on. We have the Coast Guard. And then we have this immense natural environment, which attracts a lot of researchers from around the world, including myself. And we are landlocked, so to speak. So we live on this narrow strip of land, which on one side you have the Pacific Ocean. That's on the west side. On the east side, you have steep mountains that end up in the Juneau ice field. And there is one main road in town, and then it literally ends at the northern and southern boundaries. It just ends in the rainforest. So to get to Juneau, you either have to come by airplane or ferry or boat.
Yeah, I think from what I remember, Juneau has the distinction of being the only U.S. state capital that you can't get to by road. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, that is pretty neat. And, it's those beautiful mountains and, of course, the ocean that give it that kind of unique designation. Now, you mentioned rainforest. So for listeners that aren't familiar, they might be surprised to hear you talk about a rainforest in Alaska. But this is not a tropical rainforest, right? Tell us a little bit about what a temperate rainforest in Southeast Alaska is like.
Yes, and you're absolutely correct. A lot of people think rainforests are only in the tropics, but we are in a temperate rainforest. It's called the Tongass National Rainforest. It's the largest temperate rainforest in the world. It starts just north of the Seattle, Washington area and extends all the way up along British Columbia into Southeast Alaska. And it has everything you might think of with a tropical rainforest, except it's much cooler, but we get lots of rain each year. It's over 100 inches of rain. I don't know to be exact, but it's certainly
that's
a lot of rain.
Yeah, that's a lot.
But then we turn into a snow forest in the wintertime. We get a lot of snow as well. So we have really lush vegetation in the rainforest. One of my favorite plants is called the skunk cabbage, and they're starting to come out right now. They get their name because they actually have a smell, a kind of a pungent smell like a skunk. But to me, whenever I start smelling that in the spring, it's a sign of summer. So I've come to really like that. Anyway, so there's a lot of cool plants and, of course, animals in the temperate rainforest.
And I guess when I think about those temperate rainforests, I'm sort of picturing a lot of ferns and dense mats of moss, just moss everywhere.
Yes, and we call that dense moss when it's on the ground. We call it muskeg. And it's spongy. We all wear extra tufts, those really ugly brown rubber boots. And those are great for walking through the spongy muskeg because it's very soft, but then it's also very moist also.
Now, I think when a lot of people think of Alaska, they think about harsh, cold winters. How cold does it get actually in the winter in Juneau?
In Juneau, we actually have a pretty mild climate. So I grew up in Iowa, the Midwestern plains, and the winters that I grew up with are much more severe than we have here in Juneau. So we're right on the Pacific Ocean, and, being a huge mass of water, oceans help to moderate temperature. So we don't get too hot or too cool. I would say in the wintertime, we have about 2 weeks maybe where we are in the single digits, maybe even below zero. So we get a cold snap, but otherwise Our winters can be in the 20s and 30s. We oscillate right around freezing quite a bit.
And how about the darkness? So that's another kind of famous thing that people think about with Alaska is kind of a long stretch where it really doesn't get light. Does that happen down in Southeast Alaska as well?
It does, but not to the extreme that some of my colleagues up in Fairbanks or even up in Uktiavik, formerly known as Barrow. So our shortest day of the year on the winter solstice, we probably have about 6 hours of daylight, which is decent, And on the flip side of that, we're coming to the summer solstice now where we're going to have about 18 hours of daylight. But I will say that because we have so much cloud cover and precipitation, oftentimes I feel like my colleagues in Fairbanks actually get more light than we do in the winter because they don't have all the clouds that we do. So the clouds really have a moderating effect on everything.
Do those clouds mean that you don't get to see the northern lights?
Unfortunately, our northern light viewing can be kind of dim sometimes, but we do get periods where, you can look at the forecast online, and if you're diligent about it and you're watching the northern lights forecast and then the weather forecast, you can get some pretty spectacular viewings.
That's definitely one of my life goals. I still have not had a chance to see the aurora, so one of these days I'm gonna hopefully get that opportunity. It sounds really amazing.
Yeah, it's definitely worth it.
So what about Southeast Alaska more generally? Do you have any kind of favorite places that you've been in, outside of Juneau in Southeast Alaska more generally?
One of my other favorite towns in Southeast Alaska is Sitka. Sitka is on the outer coast. So Juneau, we're in the Inside Passage. We're not on the open ocean, but Sitka is. So it is west of Juneau a little bit, and it's on an island, but it's exposed to the Pacific Ocean. And it is a beautiful little town because it has that open ocean exposure. And it also has a very nice art scene. And I go there every year. I teach a class where I bring students to Sitka Whale Fest every fall. And the first time I went there, I remember thinking, this town is quite a bit like, if you ever watch the old show Northern Exposure, I'm probably dating myself. But
I'm right there with you. Yes, that was a favorite show of mine as well. Yep.
Yeah. So I kind of think of Sitka as being kind of close to that fictional Northern Exposure town. So I'd say that's one of my favorite spots in Southeast.
That's awesome. That definitely paints a very vivid picture for me, at least, knowing that reference to that show. So you mentioned that you're originally from Iowa. I'm also actually a Midwesterner. I grew up in Illinois, so not far from where you grew up. Tell me a little bit about how you got from Iowa to Alaska. What was your kind of career pathway? Did you always want to be in Alaska and study whales and other marine mammals, or what were you interested in when you were young?
Yeah, I think I can say I never would have imagined myself living in Alaska and studying whales. So I grew up in Des Moines, the capital, and in high school we had what's called a magnet school where you could go to one central school downtown and take specialty classes. And so I took a class in marine biology for 2 years as a high schooler. And we had our own saltwater aquariums to take care of. A central part of the course was we all got scuba certified, and we went to the Florida Keys over spring break and went diving and snorkeling and sailing.
That's amazing. What a cool class.
It is, and it still exists today. And so that was really my first introduction to marine biology. But before that, I was always interested in animal behavior and animal conservation. And even when I went to college, I went to Duke and I studied both primates. I did a lot of work at the Duke Lemur Center. And then I also studied at the Duke Marine Lab so I could study marine mammals. And so I was able to kind of pursue both of those passion areas. And then in grad school, just how things turned out, I got into a marine mammalogy graduate program. I went to Texas A&M. And from there, I went to Gloucester, Massachusetts. I worked with a small nonprofit for a couple years and then got into academia and, long story short, landed at University of Alaska Southeast in 2011.
Very cool. And from what I understand, you did your PhD research on dolphins, but dolphins not in North America, but actually down in New Zealand, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
That's right. I studied the dusky dolphins on the South Island of New Zealand. And in fact, I just returned from my field site there in April. So one of the projects I was able to do on sabbatical this year is to go back to one of the places I worked in New Zealand and try to revive some of the dusky dolphin research I had started as a graduate student now 21 years ago. So yes, dusky dolphins are still near and dear to my heart. And whenever grant funding and time allows, I do like to get back there to continue those studies.
So you are combining topics that we have covered in a variety of different episodes this season in Wild World, actually, because we had an episode about lemurs in Madagascar. We had one about primate behavior with chimpanzees in Senegal. And then most recently, we actually did an episode about New Zealand, but we were focused on the birds. So maybe you could just very briefly tell us a little bit about dusky dolphins and what makes them interesting and special.
Yes. Well, they are a smaller dolphin. They are maybe 6 feet in length. They have this beautiful, like gray and white pattern on them, which I guess is why they're called the duskies. But what intrigues me about them is their social behavior. So what I studied for my PhD was their social structure. So basically, who do they associate with? What are their friendships like? What's their behavior in different contexts and habitat uses? So, social networks and that type of thing. So dusky dolphins, they're very gregarious and social. At one of the places where I study them off Kaikoura, they occur in large groups regularly of 200 to 300 individuals, sometimes more.
Wow.
And one of the things that we do just on a basic level is we do photo identification. So we take photos of distinctive markings, which for them is their dorsal fin. And by recognizing individuals, we can track them through time. And then what I'm interested in is figuring out their association patterns. So kind of unraveling these details of the dusky dolphin social lives is what intrigues me about them. And they're a really fun species to study because they form all types of different social groups. Some of them even move to different habitats and different times of year. And then another thing, they're just really fun to watch. They're called the acrobats of the sea. They are a very acrobatic dolphin. They do all kinds of leaps and somersaults and flips for communication, for mating displays, probably just for fun. And when we were there in New Zealand, my small research team was my husband, who does a lot of work with me, and then my 5-year-old daughter. And we were on this small open skiff, and we would always joke that the dusky dolphins were purposefully coming up to our boat and leaping and splashing us because we would get wet all the time because they're just so playful. And so they're really intriguing for their social complexity, but they're also just a lot of fun.
Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll hear about the whales that call Southeast Alaska home and some of their unique and amazing behaviors. The Rice Alumni Traveling Owls program offers exciting intellectual itineraries to destinations across the globe. Traveling Owls trips serve as a catalyst for lifelong learning and strengthen bonds between Rice University alumni and friends. But you don't have to be a Rice alum to participate in Traveling Owls programs. I'll be hosting a Traveling Owls trip to Southeast Alaska in August 2026. On a tour organized by National Geographic Lindblad Expeditions. We would love to have you join us. Visit alumni.rice.edu/travelingowls for all the details. You can also call 713-34-TRIPS or email travelingowls@rice.edu to ask questions or sign up. You're listening to Wild World. I'm Scott Solomon, and I'm speaking with marine biologist Heidi Pearson. So let's talk a bit about whales, and specifically whales in Southeast Alaska. So I know there's several different whales that are commonly seen in Southeast Alaska, and humpback whales are maybe some of the most well-known and commonly seen. So, speaking of complex social behaviors, like humpback whales have some pretty interesting social behaviors. And when I've had the opportunity to see them in the wild, they seem like they're very playful, like they're leaping out of the ocean. They're doing, slapping their fins and different things like that. Am I right that they're kind of playful, or am I totally misinterpreting the behavior of these whales?
No, you're right. And I agree. I think humpback whales they're probably the most animated baleen whale. So we have the toothed whale just have teeth like dolphins, and then humpback whales have baleen instead of teeth. We call them baleen whales. They're the largest whales. And yeah, they are more, we call surface active, more playful, and they're more social. So we think, than other whale species. And that is an intriguing thing for me. When studying them, I'm also trying to understand some of those social relationships amongst the humpback whales, like I'm doing with the dusky dolphins.
And I know that, they are also famous for having these complex calls. And, this is one of those things where, like, I feel like, we see studies that come out every now and then about, like, some new discovery about how humpback whales are using their calls or the way they're spreading. How much do we really understand the calls of humpback whales?
I think we're still at the tip of the iceberg. So, for all cetaceans, whales, and dolphins, hearing is their dominant sense. So it makes sense that is the way that they communicate. And for humpback whales, their elaborate song has been studied for decades. There's a lot of great work that's been done on Hawaii and on the breeding grounds. And we know that the song is only done by males. So it's a male behavior. We're still not quite sure of the exact reason. It likely has some kind of mating function, but it's still not clear. And then move to the feeding grounds where I am in Alaska. They do produce what we call social sounds when they're bubble nut feeding, when you'll have a group of, 10 to up to 20 humpback whales working together, blowing bubbles to corral herring. There's this really loud feeding call that will be produced by what we think is one member of the group. But we are still trying to unravel what all that means, especially on the feeding grounds.
Yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit more about that bubble net feeding, because that's a fascinating behavior. I've seen it sort of captured in nature documentaries, and I've maybe seen a little bit of it myself in the wild, but I wasn't quite sure. So, like, I've seen them blowing bubbles and then coming up to the surface. But tell us a little bit more about what bubble net feeding is and how they do it.
Bubble net feeding is a truly cooperative behavior that humpback whales perform. And many humpback whale populations around the world use bubbles of some sort as tools. It's a tool. And in Southeast Alaska, they make bubble nets. And so we've learned more about this through underwater camera tags that have been put on whales in recent years. So it's usually one whale, you have a group of, say, 10 whales, and they dive down. Usually one whale will start blowing bubbles out of their blowhole, these small bubbles, and then they will gradually swim around the outside of a large school of herring. And the other whales will then circle around that school to essentially trap them. Meanwhile, this one whale, maybe others, have joined in to start blowing bubbles out of their blowholes to make this net of bubbles. And this net then traps the herring inside. And then while the whales are making the bubble net around the herring, they're also moving upwards towards the surface to herd the herring towards the surface. And then when you get to the surface, that actually acts like another barrier for the herring because, of course, it's air. And so at that point, then the whales will open their mouths and lunge feed, through that herring trapped in that bubble net. And I see it pretty often, but I still am amazed by it. And I think it's one of the most amazing wildlife spectacles that we can view because you have, this huge mass of whales in a pretty small space, and it's this cooperative, intelligent behavior. It's really cool.
I mean, that is amazing. It's, they're coordinating their movements, and they, like you've said, they figured out how to use bubbles as a tool. I mean, that's just amazing. I mean, they're so intelligent. So I'm trying to picture this behavior in my mind, right? So the idea is like they're releasing bubbles out of their blowholes, and those bubbles are traveling up towards the surface. And I guess the fish scared by the bubbles, or they can't or don't want to swim through the bubbles? Is that right?
Yeah, it probably elicits a fright response in the fish so that they cluster closer together. And then another thing is that we think it's one whale will produce this very, very loud feeding call. It's like an atonal sound. It kind of sounds like a horn. Sometimes if it's really quiet, we can hear it on the boat above the surface of the water.
Wow.
And so it's thought that a whale makes that really, really loud call to further frighten the fish. And it could be that if the fish would try to go through that bubble net, the sound would be louder. So that the net combined with that sound causes them to school more tightly together. And then meanwhile, amidst all this, some of the group members are swimming up from the bottom of the herring school and herding it basically towards the surface. So it definitely is a group effort.
Yeah, that's just amazing. I mean, I guess comparable in some ways to the way that like wolves hunt together in packs, or lions coordinate their hunting behaviors. Are those reasonable comparisons?
They are, absolutely. And there is likely some division of labor where certain individuals do the same role each time. I don't know that that's quite been worked out yet, but we know, for example, with African wild dogs, they do have that division of labor. It's likely that occurs in humpback whales too. But the cool thing is that they're also using a tool, you know, so there's not many other wild animals that are cooperating like that and using a tool.
Absolutely. It's incredible. Wow. Well, let's talk about one of the other amazing whales that lives in Southeast Alaska, the orcas, or sometimes called killer whales. And speaking of, complex social behaviors and very intelligent animals, I mean, from what I understand, orcas are some of the most intelligent animals out there. Is that right?
They are. I mean, I will never doubt the intelligence of an orca, but I will say our perception of their intelligence is a bit skewed because they have been unfortunately held in captivity. And so we've been able to perform different types of cognitive tests on them, observe them more closely as compared to, say, a humpback whale or a sperm whale, which I would argue are probably just as quote unquote smart, but they just haven't been in captivity and able to be studied under human terms. But yes, all that to say, orca are one of the most intelligent animals, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. We're limited in the ways that we have been able to study all different sorts of animals. And so for orcas, I mean, they live in pods, right? They're very social. And from what I understand, they have a matriarchal society where the sort of elder female is kind of the leader of the pod.
They do. And so in Southeast Alaska, we have 3 different types, which are called ecotypes. And they're not species. They're not even a subspecies. They're all orca or killer whale, but they have diverged into different body morphologies, and they have different feeding strategies. They have different calls. And all of this, we think, is because of their possession of culture and shared knowledge that is passed down through generation, which has kind of separated the population up here in the Northeast Pacific into 3 different ecotypes. So the ecotype you mentioned is the resident ecotype, which are matriarchal, as you said, and they are unique in that neither the male nor the female offspring will leave their mother's pod. So they will always stay in their mother's pod. And then you're like, well, you might be thinking, oh, well, what about inbreeding or, genetic diversity? Well, they do get together in these superpods and mate then. Another interesting thing that's been revealed about these resident killer whales is that they're female led, and the males, of course, are the more showy ones because they have the large dorsal fins, which can be like 6 feet tall, but they are really mama's boys. They stay with their mom for life. And it's been found really interesting that if a male's mother dies, his chance of dying greatly increases.
Oh, wow.
So his longevity is is linked to his mother's longevity.
What is it that she's doing to help him to live longer?
She is doing so much. She is the group member that has stored knowledge of, say, what to eat, where to eat, all of the nuances that it takes to survive successfully in the complex killer whale social network. So you can think of it probably like elephants. We think of those matriarchs as knowing where to go to get water in times of drought, that type of thing. I think it's these matriarch, these older female killer whales that lead these resident pods that have the knowledge for the group to thrive and succeed.
And along those lines, I've read that orcas are some of the only other animals that are known to have menopause, which, as I understand it, is perhaps connected to the fact that the older females play such an important role in the social lives and in the lives more generally of those orcas.
Yes, and that's a really important point. I'm glad you mentioned that. So, yeah, it's uncommon for females to stop reproducing because the purpose of life biologically is to reproduce. There has to be some function for an animal to live past menopause. And for killer whales, these grandmothers, if you want to think of it, they have additional knowledge to share with the rest of the pod. They can also help in caregiving, which is a big thing as well. And, the more we study these complex cetaceans, the more instances we're finding of menopause. So I know menopause has also been found in narwhals and pilot whales, and there's probably one or two more I'm forgetting right now. But as these long-term studies continue, I think we will find more instances of menopause in cetaceans.
Just so interesting. So we've talked about humpback whales and orcas. What other types of whales can you find in Southeast Alaska?
Well, at my study site near Juneau, we also have two species of porpoise, which are a type of toothed whale. We have the Dall's porpoise and the harbor porpoise. They aren't as predictable in my study site, and they're harder to find and to study and observe because they're smaller. But Dall's porpoise are lots of fun. Some people mistake them at first glance for a killer whale calf because they're small and they're black and white. They are some of the fastest swimmers. They're like little torpedoes. We call it, they slice through the water and create all this spray. They actually have a special adaptation in their heart to allow them to basically exercise at that high level. They love to bow ride, but they're really hard to get a photo of for photo ID because they're so fast. And then contrast that to the harbor porpoise, which also occur in our study area. They're pretty small, they're cryptic, but there's been a lot of attention paid to them lately for management because there's some evidence that they are caught at pretty high rates in bycatch, which is causing population declines in Southeast Alaska. So on that front, there's some more studies going on to try to figure out the population status. But yeah, so those are two other cetaceans that occur in my study site.
What about minke whales? Do those ever show up in Southeast Alaska?
They do, so they would be more common in the outer coast, like in the Sitka area that I mentioned. We have gray whales in Southeast Alaska as well, but again, they're more in the open ocean or coastal. One time in April, we saw a juvenile gray whale in the Juneau area. We have a sighting every once in a while of a sperm whale in the inside waters. I've never seen one in Southeast Alaska. But as far as whales, it's really those two porpoise species, humpback whales and killer whales, that we have at my study site near Juneau. And then as you get further towards the open waters of the Pacific, you'll see a greater variety.
After another quick break, we'll hear about some of the research Heidi is doing to understand the impact of tourism on Alaska's whales. The Rice Alumni Traveling Owls program offers exciting intellectual itineraries to destinations across the globe. Traveling Owls trips serve as a catalyst for lifelong learning and strengthen bonds between Rice University alumni and friends. But you don't have to be a Rice alum to participate in Traveling Owls programs. I'll be hosting a Traveling Owls trip to Southeast Alaska in August 2026, on a tour organized by National Geographic Lindblad Expeditions. We would love to have you join us. Visit alumni.rice.edu/travelingowls for all the details. You can also call 713-34-TRIPS or email travelingowls@rice.edu to ask questions or sign up. Welcome back. My guest is Dr. Heidi Pearson, a marine biologist who studies whales in Southeast Alaska. So how common is it to see a whale in Southeast Alaska, like near Juneau? If you're out for a boat ride, or if you're out fishing or something like that, is it like pretty likely that you'd see a whale? Is it a rare and unusual thing to see?
It's very likely, and that is one of the drawing cards that brought me to Juneau, Alaska, was the high biodiversity and reliability of marine mammals in this area. So I would say from early May, in most years, from early May through early October, you have almost a 100% chance of seeing a humpback whale in the waters near Juneau. The humpback whales are only up here during that time period because that's the feeding season. Otherwise, they migrate down to breeding grounds. But then if we consider the other types of whales, like those two porpoise species and killer whales throughout the whole year, you still have a chance. I would say maybe if you would go out every day all year long, if you could do that with the weather, on average, even in the off season, you would probably see a porpoise or a killer whale on average about once a week. So it's a pretty good place to be for seeing marine mammals.
Yeah, no kidding. That's incredible. And of course, that draws a lot of tourists who come for whale watching specifically. And I know this is something that you have actually studied, right? Like you in your research, one of the things you're doing is looking at how does whale watching actually affect the whales themselves. So tell us a little bit about that research. Like, how do you actually study that?
Yeah, so I've been interested in this issue for quite some time. You know, Juneau, the whale watching industry is directly tied to the cruise ship industry, which has been increasing steadily year after year. And so together with my graduate students over the past, it's been 10 years now, we have looked at this question in various ways. And the question is, if and how does whale watching impact humpback whales? So the first set of studies we did was looking at behavioral responses, and we used some observation tools that we could observe whales from land. We used a theodolite, which is a surveyor's instrument, where we could track the whale locations and then also track boat locations and see if whale behavior changed in the presence versus absence of whale watch boats. And we did find that in the presence of whale watch boats, humpback whales tended to have shorter dive times, faster breath rates, and they change direction more often, indicating a behavioral change. And then starting in 2020, we started trying to layer on, is there a physiological response of humpback whales to whale watching? And to do that, we started collecting blubber biopsy samples from whales to measure their stress hormones. Particularly, we're looking at cortisol and corticosterone, which humans also have, and we can measure that from blubber samples obtained through remote darting. And the reason we started that in 2020, of course, was the pandemic, where we didn't have any cruise ships in Juneau, very, very little vessel traffic on the water. So we use that period as a control period to see what is their stress level like during a time of little to no vessel traffic compared to when tourism rebounded.
That's very interesting. I mean, yeah, because you would maybe otherwise not have a way of knowing, like, well, what would happen when there aren't any tourist boats around, whale watching boats around, because presumably they're always around when there are whales around. So yeah, so that's a clever way of taking advantage of the pandemic, I guess. So what did you find? Like what's the conclusion?
So it, like many things in science, it's ended up being a lot more complex than we thought. And I will say that we are still analyzing the final results. We've had to rerun some of the samples and for consistency, and we're hoping to be able to reveal our results sometime within a year. But it's such a big question that we want to make sure when we put the results out that we are 100% can stand behind it scientifically. But it's not just the stress that we're looking at. We're also looking at residency patterns. So how long do whales stay in Juneau? And, when we didn't have a lot of vessels in Juneau, were they staying longer than when tourism returned? And what we found was really so far no difference, that the whales that came to Juneau were here no matter the vessel traffic. One interesting thing we found, though, is that females tend to stay in Juneau longer than males, which I think is a really interesting finding because it means it's an important place for this more vulnerable part of the population to be, especially if they're here with their calves. So it just speaks to the importance of this area for humpback whales.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I'm thinking about the study of like the impact of whale watching. And I'm imagining that there's, not all whale watching is maybe done the same. Like maybe there are some operators or boats that are really, really cautious and careful, and maybe others a little bit less so. Do you see any evidence of that in your data? Is there like variation in the whale watching practices that maybe affects how the whales are responding? Or maybe too soon to say?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm just thinking back to the studies I've done. We haven't been able to collect data at that fine scale of resolution yet. What we have been able to collect data on is, this blanket presence versus absence or number of boats. But as far as the boat behavior, type of boat, we talked about all these kinds of variables, but we just haven't been able to tease all those out yet. But I just will also say there is a law in place where no boats, whale watch boat, recreational boat can approach closer than 100 yards. So we do have that in place to help mitigate some of the potential effects on whales.
Yeah, that's good. I was going to ask you about what kinds of protections are in place for whales in Southeast Alaska. I imagine there's probably others.
That is the only law or regulation. Well, part of that regulation is also that you're not to change the behavior of whales or cut off their path. But really that 100-yard thing is the main one. And then there's other guidelines for best practice, like not staying with a whale for more than 30 minutes, giving moms and calves extra space. But those are guidelines and they aren't laws.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's an important distinction. So what are some of the threats in general that whales are facing, like especially the whales that you're studying in Southeast Alaska? What are the challenges that they're experiencing?
They have a few. And so in no particular order, I can say vessel strikes, fisheries entanglements, climate change, and pollution. And that would include noise pollution. And we've seen evidence of all of those pretty readily apparent. In the long-term study I've been doing of humpback whales here since 2013, we have good evidence of all of those risk factors impacting whales.
Yeah, and I know, one of the things that your lab has really looked at is climate change, right? And the role of whales in sort of, as sort of mediators, as players in the carbon cycle, right? And you study something called blue carbon. So maybe you can explain what blue carbon is.
Sure. So blue carbon refers to ways that the marine environment can naturally store and sequester carbon. And it was a phrase originally given to marine vegetation like mangroves and salt marshes and seagrasses. But then more recently, let's say in the past 8 to 10 years, it's been applied to marine animals as well. And so that's a topic I started getting interested in more fully when I was a Fulbright scholar to Norway in 2018. That was a focus of my work.
Very interesting. So, whales are sort of part of the marine ecosystem, and so they're part of everything that's going on with the role of oceans. How important are oceans generally for climate change?
Oh, they are so important. I mean, we would not be alive today on this planet without oceans. They naturally absorb carbon dioxide through different pathways. But the estimate that I always use is the oceans naturally absorb 25% of the anthropogenic or human-caused CO2 emissions. And so the planet would be a much hotter place without the ocean and the animals that live there.
Yeah, definitely. And what about whales? Sort of what is their part in that giant cycle of carbon moving from the atmosphere to the ocean and back and forth? How do whales figure in?
So they play important roles in both the nutrient and carbon cycling. And with my work, I look at both the nutrient cycling and carbon cycling roles of whales because they're intertwined. And so with I will say the nutrient cycling piece, we have a much better understanding of. The carbon cycling piece, not as good of an understanding. But the nutrient cycling piece, one of the things I study is the whale pump. And just to put it bluntly, they poop a lot at the surface, and the poop has a lot of nutrients that otherwise wouldn't be at the surface. And these nutrients can cause phytoplankton to grow and basically stimulate the entire food web to make an area more productive. And with that can come some increase in carbon cycling, as some of that phytoplankton that otherwise wouldn't be there can sink to the seafloor, because phytoplankton is like a plant that absorbs CO2. So my lab has been working on that whale pump mechanism for some time, and then we're trying to connect the dots to carbon cycling, which is much trickier. But we know that whales, they do store and sequester carbon just by virtue of being really big. They can store a lot of carbon in their massive bodies for long periods of time. And then when they sink, those carcasses, a lot of them sink to the seafloor, where the carbon that was stored in their body now becomes sequestered at the seafloor. But we've done some estimations of the amount of carbon that we can say whales store or sequester, and it's actually very, very, very small. So if we consider, the whole global carbon cycle, whales are not a major player. But as with everything, I think every little bit helps. And in addition to these possible carbon benefits, they also have these benefits to biodiversity and ocean health overall.
Yeah. And what do you see as sort of the role of ecotourism in all of this? So, sometimes there's a kind of a tension between people not wanting to have a negative impact on these wild places, but then by going and getting to experience an amazing wild place and have an encounter with these incredible animals, perhaps people become more engaged, more motivated to want to have a positive impact. How do you think about that kind of balance?
I do think about that a lot. And one of the previous studies I've done with students is we have surveyed passengers on whale watches in Juneau before and after their trip to try to gauge that. And we did find that whale watching had a positive impact on conservation and people's desire to have whale protection. So there's definitely some positive impacts, huge educational value as well. But that has to be balanced with impacts on the whales themselves and then, increased emissions. And I don't want to deny anyone the chance to see a whale in the wild. I saw a gray whale off the coast of Oregon for the first time. I was maybe 12 or 13, and that was a really nice experience. And, now it's my career. So it can be very impactful, but it needs to be done thoughtfully and so that it doesn't turn out to be a tragedy of the commons with a resource, in this case, whales, being exploited so that it's no longer sustainable.
So what are some things that people can do if they're thinking of, visiting Southeast Alaska and they want to make sure they're being responsible tourists and specifically with whales in mind? What are some things that they can do to make sure they can visit but be having, a positive impact to the extent that's possible? And also, what are some things that people can do more generally if they're not living in a place where there are whales, if they're not going to be, coming to Southeast Alaska?
Yeah, those are great questions. So for seeing whales in Southeast Alaska, I would just encourage people to do their homework and look at the the websites on the companies and see if they are part of the Whale Sense program, which is the responsible tourist program. They do extra things. They abide by extra guidelines to try to lessen their potential impact on whales. So definitely go with a Whale Sense operator. And then, just look at their practices aside from whales. Like, do they recycle on board? Things like that. Do they say anything about emissions from their fleet? Another thing anyone can do in Southeast Alaska for free is there's lots of places you can see not just whales, but also seals and sea lions from shore. And yeah, there's some hot spots where you can just walk out on some of our beautiful trails and see whales and humpback whales and sometimes killer whales from shore. So just do your homework, I guess, would be my advice for choosing a whale watch operator. And then everyone can help to protect the oceans. Even where I grew up in Iowa, all rivers lead to the ocean. And so just make sure that you don't litter, that you cut anything with a loop, make sure and cut it, especially those plastic 6-pack rings. Some of the work I've done with NOAA with pinniped entanglement, lose the loop. Anything before you put it in the garbage, cut it to make sure it's not a loop that can then end up around a seal or even a seabird's neck or something. We can all do things to decrease our carbon footprint and joining conservation organizations to help the cause. I mean, I could go on, but no matter where you live, you can do something to help the oceans.
In our final segment, I'll ask Heidi about something I've been dying to know about whales. The Rice Alumni Traveling Owls program offers exciting intellectual itineraries to destinations across the globe. Traveling Owls trips serve as a catalyst for lifelong learning and strengthen bonds between Rice University alumni and friends. But you don't have to be a Rice alum to participate in Traveling Owls programs. I'll be hosting a Traveling Owls trip to Southeast Alaska in August 2026 on a tour organized by National Geographic Lindblad Expeditions. We would love to have you join us. Visit alumni.rice.edu/travelingowls for all the details. You can also call 713-34-TRIPS or email travelingowls@rice.edu to ask questions or sign up. This is Wild World. I'm Scott Solomon, and I'm speaking with marine biologist Heidi Pearson about her work on whales and other marine mammals in Southeast Alaska. So, you brought up some of the other marine mammals other than whales that occur in Southeast Alaska. And I know you've done some work with sea otters, which are just, these incredibly cute animals. Like, people love to see sea otters, but they also have a really important, role that they play in marine ecosystems. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my first introduction to Alaska was my master's work. I studied sea otters in Prince William Sound. And I studied the behavior of territorial males. And so I got to know a lot about their mating strategies and their reproductive behaviors. We identified sea otters based on scars on their noses, which was a lot of fun and challenging.
Wow.
So my master's work was more behavioral focused. But then around 2016, 2017, I worked with a team of other researchers, mostly up here in Southeast Alaska, to look at the ecosystem roles of sea otters. And so we were looking at the impact sea otters have on kelp forest growth. So it's called this trophic cascade. Sea otters, one of their favorite prey items are sea urchins, and sea urchins love to eat kelp. So if you have a lot of sea otters, the logic is that they depress the sea urchin population. There's fewer sea urchins mowing down these kelp forests, and you have more kelp.
And
and that's considered a healthy ecosystem. Mm-hmm.
Just to make sure people know about kelp. So if you're not from the West Coast and seen, kelp in person, it's an algae, but it's a giant algae, right? Like they have, as you said, forests that basically grow from being attached to the seafloor and grow up towards the light. And they're really an important part of those ecosystems, right?
Right. So kelp is, a type of seaweed. And the kelp that we studied is called the surface canopy kelp, like you described, like giant kelp, the biggest kelp, will anchor to the seafloor, and then it can grow to be 40 to 50 feet tall. And like you say, it creates these beautiful forests that provides lots of habitat for other animals. And then if we're thinking about one of the big additional ecosystem benefits is that it's a plant. And so it is absorbing carbon dioxide like trees on land. And so in my study, we didn't quite get to that link to link sea otter populations with kelp forest growth and the carbon link. But we know that through time, as there were more sea otters in an area, it allowed, for the most part, more kelp forest to grow.
Because the sea otters, by eating these urchins, that's allowing kelp to grow because the urchins aren't eating so much of the kelp. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. It's called a trophic cascade. So it's this cascade or waterfall effect starting with the sea otters.
Because you have basically like a food chain or a food web, right? And like different trophic levels. That's where that term comes from, right? Like going from the top predator down the sort of pyramid towards the base. This kind of cascading effect, I guess, right?
Yes, exactly.
And sea otters were hunted historically was it for their fur? Is that why they were hunted?
Yes.
I assume they're better protected these days.
They are. So under the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972, all hunting of marine mammals, including sea otters, was banned. The only exception is that Alaska Native peoples can hunt sea otters for subsistence use, because for traditional uses, they have hunted sea otters for the luxurious pelts that they use for clothing and handicrafts. And that practice still continues today, but it is only by the Alaska Natives.
And what about some of the other marine mammals in the area? Are there sea lions or seals that are commonly found in Southeast Alaska?
Yes, we have harbor seals and stellar sea lions. And the stellar sea lions are an interesting case study because there's one population that stretches from Southeast Alaska all the way to the Aleutians. And the part of the population in the western part of that range, like say Anchorage to the west of the Aleutians, that population is still declining and it's not doing very well. Whereas the population or the part of the population in the east where I am, they're doing pretty well. And so there's some pretty big ecological factors at play there, but we're pretty lucky in Southeast Alaska that most of our marine mammals are doing pretty well. Humpback whales, killer whales, stellar sea lions, harbor seals, as far as I know, Dall's porpoise, as far as I know, harbor porpoise. I mentioned maybe some interactions with fisheries, but overall, if you're a marine mammal, Southeast Alaska is a pretty good place to be.
I mean, that's fantastic to hear. That's definitely not something that you can say about marine mammals in all parts of the world.
Right. Yeah, it's a pretty special spot. And, it's a very rich place for food. The environment is just nutrient rich, these productive waters. Other than, vessels and fisheries, there's not a lot of human habitation here, so yeah, it's a pretty nice place to be.
That's fantastic. So what other research do you have going on now that you're particularly excited about?
Oh, let me think. So I mentioned the dusky dolphin research. Well, I do collaborate with a nonprofit in the south of Portugal. It's called AIM, and I work with them on different aspects of their common dolphin research and some of the same questions that I've been interested in with the dusky dolphins. We are asking of the common dolphins about their social networks and social relationships. We've also done some really cool studies there using drones to look at mother-calf relationships. And then I'm very excited. I'll be going back there this fall. I got a Fulbright Scholar Award to Portugal, so I'll be there for the fall to work with AIM and University of Lisbon on a marine mammal management plan for a new marine protected area there. So I'm excited to get more involved in marine conservation with my upcoming time in Portugal.
That's super cool. Well, congratulations. That sounds very exciting.
Thank you.
So I want to ask, because I think you're doing a job that a lot of young people and people in general just think of as kind of a dream job, right? You're a marine biologist. You're studying these amazing marine mammals, whales, dolphins, otters, all of these very charismatic, amazing animals. What advice do you have for people who are interested in marine biology and specifically marine mammalogy, like you study? What advice do you have for people who might want to get involved in this kind of work?
Yeah, I guess I would say number one is just follow your passion and what you're interested in, because that's going to get you a long ways. What I do, I mean, you make it sound very exciting and flashy, and it is, but also I spend a lot of time, like 90% of my time in front of the computer, writing reports and applying for permits and analyzing data and doing all that stuff, applying for grants. I also teach classes. And so I have many, many other things I do. Like the really cool, flashy stuff is, 5 to 10% of my job. But that's what keeps me going.
Yeah. Okay, so I have to ask you a question that I've been dying to ask a whale biologist since I learned about this. I am so curious about whale lice.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Which apparently are not lice at all, but they're actually crustaceans. What is going on with whale? First of all, maybe you can just describe what these are. And like I said, since I found out that this exists, I've just been oddly fascinated with knowing more about them.
So they're a parasite on whales. And when we see whale lice, we always note it in our photos. We actually have a keyword tag, whale lice, because it is a sign of poor health. And so if a whale has whale lice, it is a sign for us to maybe look at that animal a little bit more to see if there's any other signs of what we call poor body condition.
So I guess you said they're a parasite. So are they actually feeding off of the whale itself, or are they consuming something like, I don't know, whales are often covered in barnacles. Are they maybe picking off those barnacles? What are they actually doing?
I think they are feeding on parts of the whale skin itself. But I would have to look that up to be fully sure. Like I said, no one's asked me about whale lice before.
Yeah.
But when I see them, it's actually on the whale's, like the bare skin of the whale. It's not on, say, a barnacle or something else attached to the whale.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in the photos that I've seen, it seems like they're often around the blowhole. I don't know if that's just where it's easier to photograph them or something.
They can be on any part of the body, is what I've seen.
Yeah. Very interesting. Well, thank you for helping me satisfy my curiosity about whale lice. I've been dying to ask someone.
You're welcome.
Well, Heidi Pearson, thank you so much for sharing whales and the wonders of Southeast Alaska. And it's been just a delight to have you on and hear about your work.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for all the great questions. I'm happy to be here.
To find out more about Heidi Pearson's work on whales and other marine mammals, check out the show notes, where we have a link to her website and to some other websites where you can go to learn more about whales. We also have links on our website, wildworldshow.com, along with some photos of the whales and the beautiful Alaskan scenery. You can listen to Wild World anywhere you get podcasts. Follow @WildWorldShow on social media for updates and bonus content. This episode of Wild World was supported by the Rice Alumni Traveling Owls and by National Geographic Lindblad Expeditions. Wild World is produced by 3 Wire Creative. That's it for this episode. Join me next time as we explore another part of our wild world. Hi, I'm Scott Solomon. You know, as a scientist and world traveler, I spend a lot of time on the road. And I wanted to share with you an app that can make that time more exciting, educational, and more interactive than your typical audiobook or podcast. Except for this one, of course. It's called Audio. That's AUTIO. And what it does is it uses GPS to follow your location, and then it gives you audio stories about the places that you're driving by. These stories are told by some of the best storytellers out there, like John Lithgow, Phil Jackson, Kevin Costner, and many others. The stories are short, usually about 3 to 5 minutes long, and they play for you as you drive. Or, if you prefer, you can plan a road trip and then find stories about those places to inspire you before you leave. And Audio's library of stories celebrate every voice and perspective. Rooted in curiosity, the storytelling embraces the diversity of cultures, people, and places that you discover along your travels, just like we do here on Wild World. Stories are updated and added every week, so no two journeys are ever the same. Now you can check out the audio app through a link on our website, wildworldshow.com, or in the podcast show notes. And by doing so, you'll also help our podcast to continue to bring you explorations of the natural wonders of the world and the voices of the people who explore, study, and protect them.